You may not realize it, but every time you throw away an old bucket, a broken flower pot, or a piece of weathered wood, you could be throwing away something that would make your garden look warmer and more beautiful without spending a single dollar. I made that same mistake for years because I thought a nice garden needed expensive decorations from the store. Then one spring I looked around my yard and noticed that the decorations I had bought were already faded, cracked, and forgotten, while an old wooden wheel leaning against my shed still looked better than anything I had paid for. That was the moment I understood that the best garden decorations are often the ones that already belong to us. Since then, I almost never rush to buy anything new, because I have learned that simple things can give a garden a feeling that no plastic ornament ever can. Maybe you have an old watering can that leaks a basket with a broken handle, a few smooth stones left after building a path, or even some branches after trimming fruit trees. Most people see junk. I see the beginning of something useful and pleasant. Many years ago, an elderly neighbor showed me a small trick that I have never forgotten. He smiled and said that a good garden should look like it grew together with the house, instead of being decorated all at once from a shopping cart. At that time, I did not fully understand what he meant, but after trying his old method, I finally saw the difference with my own eyes. My visitors often ask where I bought certain decorations, and they are surprised when I tell them they were made from things that would have gone into the trash. That always makes me smile because saving money feels good, but creating something with your own hands feels even better. There is one decoration in particular that costs almost nothing, takes very little time to make, and somehow becomes the first thing people notice when they walk into the garden. Most people pass by the materials for it every single day without giving them a second look. I almost did the same, and if I had, I would have missed one of the simplest ideas that changed the way my whole garden feels. Would you like to see how that old forgotten method begins? Many people think that a beautiful garden starts with buying something new, but I learned long ago that it actually starts with looking carefully at what you already have. The decoration I mentioned before came from an old metal watering can that had a tiny hole in the bottom. Most people would throw it away because it could no longer do its original job. I almost did exactly that until I remembered what my neighbor once told me. He said never hurry to throw away anything that has aged naturally because nature likes things that already have a story. I cleaned the watering can with warm water and a simple brush without trying to make it shine like new. That is another mistake many people make. They polish everything until it loses its old charm. A few scratches and a little faded paint make it look like it has always belonged in the garden. I found a quiet corner near a flower bed where the morning sun reaches first. I placed a flat stone underneath so it would stay steady even after heavy rain. Then I filled the watering can with a small pot of trailing flowers instead of soil alone. Soon the green stems began hanging over the sides, and it looked as if flowers were gently pouring out instead of water. Every visitor noticed it before anything else. They asked where I bought such an unusual decoration, and they were surprised when I pointed to the old shed where that watering can had been forgotten for years. The best part was that I spent almost nothing because I already had everything I needed. The flowers were divided from plants already growing in another corner of the garden, and even the stone came from an old path I had rebuilt years before. Very few people do this because they believe decorations must be expensive to look attractive. In my experience, the opposite is often true. The simpler the idea, the more natural it feels. There is another small secret that makes this method work even better, and I learned it only after making the same mistake several times. Most people place decorations right in the center, where everyone can see them immediately. I used to do that too until I discovered a much better place that quietly catches the eye without looking forced. That one small change made every handmade decoration seem twice as beautiful, and the next example surprised even me the first time I tried it. Is everything okay with this block? One thing I noticed after a few seasons is that people often spend money on large decorations because they think bigger always means better. I used to believe that as well until I started paying attention to the small corners of the garden instead of the open spaces. That is where I discovered another old method that almost no one talks about anymore. After trimming fruit trees every spring, I always had a pile of branches that seemed useful but never important enough to keep. One year I decided not to burn them or haul them away. I chose several branches with interesting shapes and let them dry for a few days in the shade. Then I pushed them carefully into the ground near a flower bed and tied a few pieces together with ordinary natural twine instead of wire. It looked simple at first, and I honestly wondered if I had wasted my time. A few weeks later, climbing flowers and green vines began wrapping around those old branches by themselves. Suddenly, that plain corner looked alive and completely natural, as if it had always been there. Visitors assumed I had bought some expensive wooden garden support from a specialty shop. When I explained that it came from branches I had almost thrown away, they could hardly believe it. That is why I always tell people not to hurry when cleaning the yard, because what seems useless today may become the most attractive detail tomorrow. There is another small mistake that many people make here. They try to arrange every branch perfectly straight and evenly spaced. Nature almost never works that way. I leave a little unevenness because that is exactly what makes the whole decoration feel warm and real. An old gardener showed me this many years ago, and he simply said that if something looks too perfect, it usually looks out of place in a real garden. I remembered those words every time I started trying too hard to improve my work. The funny thing is that the less I forced everything into perfect order, the more compliments I received. But there was one decoration that impressed my grandchildren even more than these natural wooden supports. It was made from something sitting quietly in almost every garage or shed, and most people never imagine it could become one of the most charming parts of the entire garden. That little idea changed the atmosphere around my favorite sitting place in a way I never expected. There is one corner in my garden where people almost always stop without me saying a word. They look around for a moment and then they smile because the place feels peaceful, even though nothing there is expensive. The secret is an old wooden ladder that had been standing behind my shed for many years. It was too worn to use safely, and I thought about cutting it up for firewood. Then I remembered another old trick that was shown to me a long time ago. Instead of throwing it away, I washed off the dirt with plain water and left the faded paint exactly as it was. I leaned the ladder against the fence where it would catch the morning light and placed simple clay pots on each step. I did not buy new pots because older ones with small marks and different colors actually looked much better together. Some held herbs while others held bright flowers that spread gently over the edges. After only a few weeks, the whole ladder seemed to disappear behind fresh green leaves and colorful blooms. It looked as though nature had slowly claimed it over many years. Most people make one small mistake here. They fill every space with plants because they think more always looks better. I learned that empty space is just as important as flowers. When each pot has room around it, the eye notices every detail and the decoration feels calm instead of crowded. That simple idea changed the entire look of my garden without costing me anything. Another forgotten method is to mix useful plants with decorative ones. I like placing parsley, thyme, or mint next to flowering plants because they add different shades of green and pleasant scents every time someone walks past. Visitors often bend down expecting only flowers and are surprised to smell fresh herbs instead. Little moments like that make a garden memorable. I also learned not to rush the process. Every season I add only one small handmade decoration instead of changing everything at once. This keeps the garden looking natural and gives me time to enjoy each improvement. Very few people have the patience to do this anymore, but I believe it is one of the reasons older gardens have so much character. Still, there is one decoration that always becomes the favorite of children and adults alike, because it begins with the simplest stones lying quietly on the ground. Most people walk past those stones every day without realizing what they could become, and that next idea might be the easiest project of them all. One of the simplest things in any garden is also one of the most overlooked. I am talking about ordinary stones. Every year people collect them while digging flower beds or cleaning paths, and then pile them somewhere behind the shed because they think they have no real use. I did exactly the same until an older friend showed me a method that his father had used many years before. He picked up 3 stones of different sizes and placed them together near a small group of flowers. At first I thought that was all he was going to do, but then he brushed them clean with nothing more than water and an old broom. He did not paint them with bright colors, and he did not try to turn them into funny characters. He simply arranged them so they looked as though they had always belonged there. That lesson stayed with me because nature rarely needs decoration. It only needs a little help. Later, I began using larger stones to create gentle borders around flower beds instead of buying expensive edging from the garden center. The result surprised me because the flowers immediately looked more organized, while the whole garden still felt completely natural. Most people make one mistake here. They place stones in perfectly straight lines with equal spaces between them. I tried that once and it looked more like a parking lot than a garden. Now I place them one by one with small changes in distance and angle just as you might find them in nature. The difference is much greater than you would expect. Sometimes I leave a little moss growing on them because that soft green color gives the garden an older and warmer feeling. Very few people have the patience to do this anymore, but it costs nothing, and every year the result becomes even better. Another forgotten trick is to place a few flat stones near a bench or sitting area where people naturally rest their feet or set down a watering can. It makes the space feel finished without adding anything expensive. I have noticed that guests often walk toward those quiet corners without even realizing why. They simply feel comfortable there. That is something no store-bought decoration can guarantee. But there is still one handmade idea that brings everything together. It uses old wooden pieces that many people burn every autumn, and after I started making it, my neighbors began saving their own leftover wood instead of throwing it away, because they wanted to try the same simple method for themselves. The last decoration I want to share before we reach the final part is probably the one that has brought me the most satisfaction over the years because it reminds me that almost every piece of old wood deserves a second chance. Whenever I repaired a fence, replaced a shelf, or took apart an old crate, I never rushed to burn the leftover boards. Instead, I stacked them in a dry corner of the shed because experience had taught me that one day they would become useful. Many people think old wood always looks untidy, but that is only because they try to make it look brand new. I simply brush away the dirt, smooth the rough edges enough to avoid splinters, and leave the natural marks exactly where they are. Those marks tell a story and they fit perfectly into a quiet garden. One afternoon I made a small wooden sign with nothing more than a leftover board and two short pieces of wood for support. I wrote the names of my favorite herbs by hand instead of using printed labels. The letters were not perfect, but that was exactly what made the sign feel honest. Soon I made another one for the flower bed and another near the vegetable patch. Visitors often smiled because everything looked personal instead of copied from a garden store. Very few people take the time to do this anymore, and that is why handmade details attract attention. Another forgotten method is using small wooden boxes that once carried fruit or vegetables. Turn one upside down beside a bench and it becomes a simple table for a cup of tea or a watering can. Fill another with flower pots and suddenly you have different heights that make even a small corner look more interesting. None of this costs anything if you already have the materials. I always say that the best decoration is one that solves two problems at once. It saves money and gives forgotten things a useful life again. Most people never notice how many opportunities are already waiting around their own yard until they begin looking with different eyes. After that, they stop asking what they should buy and start asking what they can create. There is still one final idea I always keep for the end, because it brings all these simple methods together and helps the whole garden feel peaceful, welcoming, and complete without spending more than a few minutes of work. That final thought changed the way I look at my garden every single season. And I believe it can do the same for yours. If there is one thing I hope you remember after listening to all of this, it is that a beautiful garden is not measured by how much money you spend, but by how much care you put into it. I have learned that lesson over many years, and I can honestly say it has saved me far more than money. It has saved me from rushing to buy things I never really needed. Now when I walk through my garden, I see old watering cans filled with flowers, weathered branches supporting climbing plants, simple stones shaping quiet corners, an old ladder covered with herbs and flowers and wooden signs that remind me every day that useful things deserve a second life. None of these decorations were expensive, and none of them required special skills. They only required a little patience and the willingness to see value where most people see waste. That is an old habit that many of us grew up with, but somehow it has been forgotten. I believe it is worth bringing back because every small project gives you something more than a decoration. It gives you satisfaction every time you step outside. You begin looking at your garden differently, and even ordinary walks become more enjoyable because you remember making each little detail with your own hands. That feeling cannot be bought in any garden center. I also encourage you not to hurry. Make one decoration this week and another one next month. Let your garden grow naturally just as the plants do. After a while, you will notice that friends and neighbors stop asking how much everything cost and begin asking how you came up with so many simple ideas. That is when you realize you have created something unique without putting pressure on your budget. I still discover new uses for old materials every season, and that keeps gardening interesting no matter how many years pass. There is always another forgotten bucket, another piece of wood, another stone or flower pot waiting for a new purpose. I hope some of these old methods inspire you to look around your own yard before visiting a store, because the next decoration that makes your garden feel warm, welcoming, and truly personal may already be sitting quietly a few steps away. And if you enjoy simple, practical ideas like these, there are many more forgotten methods that deserve to be remembered, and I look forward to sharing them with you next time.